Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, Insider Indianapolis Star. This is your Friday rundown for November 17th, 2023. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Not going to do sort of the format we've been doing with the three keys and the look at the football game and kind of the weekend ahead. This has just been something that has been talked about a lot. I wrote something about it that kind of dove into a lot of different numbers, so I guess from a lot of different angles on Thursday. That's at indystar.com/sports/Hoosiers. I'll also link it at the bottom of this video if you want to read it there, but it's basically just kind of diving into the last 6+ years, how much Indiana has struggled to weaponize the 3-point line. Indiana, in the 6 years previous to this one, was outscored by 888 points behind the 3-point line. If you lop off the COVID year, which was obviously a shortened season, non-conference schedules were shorter and everything, Indiana has actually basically only gotten worse in terms of point differential on threes. In Archie Miller's first season, they were outscored by 123 points. The next 2 years, 147. Again, removing the COVID season as kind of an outlier. And then Mike Woodson's first two seasons, 177 and 189. And this has become a particularly pronounced issue because Indiana has struggled to win these first three games against teams that you would expect it to not, frankly, need to struggle with. And a big part of that has been the three-pointer. Indiana has allowed 37 made threes across its first three games. Indiana has only made 11. 37 times 3 is 111. 11 times 3 is 33. You can do the numbers. That's that is an enormous gap that Indiana is having to make up in other areas. That is just kind of creating this offensive imbalance that Indiana can't manage, and that's why Indiana is not able to put some of these teams away. What's interesting is actually if you kind of move Archie Miller's first season to one side, even that is a bit of an outlier for Indiana across the previous 5 seasons, and yet the 3-point line has still been a problem. What I mean by that is, over the previous 5 years before this one, Indiana's worst adjusted defensive efficiency number per Ken Pomeroy was 45. In that same stretch, Indiana has never been worse than 144th in opponent 3-point percentage, or basically opponent 3-point accuracy. So there's never been a time when Indiana has just had sort of like a glaring defensive weakness that has led to opponents just making a bunch of threes. In necessarily an efficient way. What Indiana's had is an enormous problem making threes of its own, and at times even just taking them. Indiana in the last 4 full seasons, again, if we remove the COVID season, 286th, 312th, 264th, and 298th nationally in makes, like where they rank nationally in made threes. In those same seasons, opponents are 209th, 238th, 295th, and 280th in made threes. And again, what this is sort of telling you is it's not like they're making them at a high volume, and if you look at Indiana's, forgive me, I'm looking at my monitor up here in my home office. If you look at Indiana's opponent 3-point percentage rankings, again, going back to it, recognizing that this year they've really struggled, and we'll talk about that in a second, but also that it's a very small sample size. Indiana has never been elite defending the three in those 5 years, if we want to bring the COVID season back in. But it's never been terrible either. 98th in opponent 3-point percentage, 98, 121, 144, 137, 134 in terms of national ranking. Indiana has never really been a team that, you go back through the last couple seasons, just in Big Ten play alone, Indiana's been top 4 in opponent 3-point percentage in the Big Ten. Now, some of that is a reflection of, frankly, the Big Ten has not been necessarily the most efficient 3-point shooting conference overall at times in the last couple of years. But the point is, Indiana's not getting outscored behind the 3-point line because they're bad defending the 3-point line. They're getting outscored behind the 3-point line because they just are not shooting threes at all. Last year, Indiana was 352nd nationally, and that was a particularly low number, 354th, nationally in 3-point attempts as a percentage of overall field goal attempts. 345th in percentage of points scored from three-pointers. In the 6 years previous to this one that is now ongoing, Indiana has never finished in the top 300 nationally in percentage of points scored from threes. There has never been any real commitment to it at all. And the issue with a problem like this is that it doesn't just have one solution, because it's a little bit of function of sort of the offensive system and emphasis that Mike Woodson and Archie Miller have sort of chosen to go with. It's a little bit of function of personnel and, maybe player development that didn't work out, or injuries in a given season, or youth, or whatever it might be. It's a little bit of function of your opponents. It's a little bit even a function of some of the things that Indiana has been good at, like, for example, sort of just absolutely pumping the ball to Trace Jackson Davis, because you want him to get 25 shots a game because he can score you 40 points from those 25 shots. But the problem it creates, and I recognize this is simplistic, but I think it's important to say it out loud, is that a three-pointer is the most valuable, from just a sheer scoring perspective, the most valuable shot you can make in basketball. And if the other team is committing to shooting more threes, even if they're not necessarily always shooting them efficiently, because they recognize you're not going to shoot them or make them very much, very often, then it's going to be harder for you to cover that gap than it is for them to open it. And I think, basically one of the primary hypotheses, I guess, that the article down below the video kind of comes to is that teams got to a place where they took threes against Indiana at a higher clip than maybe what, shot quality or shot selection might tell them they should, because they just figured, if we get a heater, if we make, 4 in 7 possessions or 4 in 9 possessions, we're scoring at a clip that Indiana can't keep up with, because they're not even going to shoot them, much less make them. And again, this is a problem that has extended across, more than 6 years now. The roster, there have been multiple head coaches. The roster's turned over multiple times. I mean, we can go as far back as Archie Miller's first season, when Indiana was only playing 18 Big Ten games, and it's still been an issue. It was even an issue in the COVID season. Indiana was outscored by 105 points in, I think, just 27 games behind the three-point line in the COVID season. They were still that season 214th in the country in total makes and 238th in the country in opponent makes. So it's not, and that's actually, arguably is I won't say as good as Indiana's been defensively, kind of in this stretch, but certainly it was not, for a season that otherwise went very poorly and ultimately led to a coaching change. Indiana wasn't, just sort of bottom of the barrel defensively that year, and it was still a problem. I think this has become a more pronounced concern, and again, I think this is probably obvious to some people, but it's just worth saying out loud. I think it's become a more pronounced concern because you have a team now that's clearly in transition. We expected that. 6 new scholarship players, so much sort of, on paper production out the door, guys in new roles, guys with new responsibilities, etc. And Indiana has actually gotten to a place where it has really started to struggle to defend the three-point line. It's not just that Indiana's not making them, and so even when teams aren't making them at a high clip or aren't making them super efficiently, just making them at all is hurting Indiana. It's that teams have started to make them. 13 of 34 for Florida Gulf Coast, 13 of 38 for Army, and last night, we're talking on Friday afternoon, so Thursday night, 11 of 26 for Wright State. Indiana is struggling, as you might expect, to be fair, with, a lot of new faces in new roles or bigger roles or expanded roles. Guys still not sort of instinctively knowing when to switch, when to rotate, when to dig, when to help, when not to help, when to stay with a shooter, all these kinds of things, And, at the moment, Indiana is 290th in the country in opponent three-point percentage, 279th in Indiana's own three-point percentage. Again, Indiana has made just 11 threes across these first 3 games. Tellingly, and again, this is probably a little bit of a small college or smaller opponent thing, Indiana's 350th in opponent percentage of field goal attempts as threes. Opponents are more than 51% of these 3 opponents' shots that Indiana's faced across these first 3 games have been three-pointers. Now, what I think is interesting is I actually think there have probably been some games in Woodson's first 2 years. I think about a Purdue game. I think about a Michigan State game where this actually hasn't been as much of a problem for Indiana because I think it is often going to be teams like a Wright State or an Army that sort of say we can't match up physically, we can't match up in length or athleticism. We have to do something a little bit unorthodox, and so we're maybe going to take some threes that we wouldn't normally. We're going to shoot them from a little bit deeper on the floor. We're going to make them come out and extend and cover us a little bit more. We're going to be more committed to this idea, even if they're not always going in, because this is kind of our way home to keeping the game close, if you understand what I'm saying. And I think that there's probably some truth to that. There's probably some, sort of some credence to that, I guess, for lack of a better term. But I think that it's been so poor, and you've seen just to the naked eye, Indiana struggle in long stretches with rotations and again, sort of when to help, when not to help, how to close out on shooters, how to be, react and sort of anticipate when the closeout's coming and things like that. That it has become even more pronounced. Now, Indiana has been able to manage this against these smaller teams for a few reasons. Most notably, Indiana's getting to the free throw line a lot. They are sixth in the country in free throw rate, which is free throw attempts divided by total field goal attempts. It's just kind of a measure of how often is a measure of your total or percentage of your total shots you're getting to the free throw line. Indiana was plus 17 at the free throw line against Florida Gulf Coast. Indiana was plus 15 against Army. Indiana was plus 7 against Wright State. The issue, of course, is sort of this balance of, maybe this isn't always such an issue against the Purdues and the Michigan States, because the Purdues and the Michigan States will think we're good enough to just play them straight up and do what we do, rather than maybe doing something a little bit unorthodox, something that might be a little bit inefficient or backfire on us. We're just going to stick with what we think works for us. And if that's not the three-pointer, we'll live with it because we think we can just kind of beat Indiana straight up. It's sometimes, I think, the smaller teams that kind of commit to this way of playing. And these two things can kind of shrink back toward the margins a little bit. Indiana's not going to get outscored by 400 points behind the 3-point line this season. I don't think anyway. You maybe are going to face teams that don't shoot the three as much because they feel like actually in 1v1 matchups with Khalil Ware or Malik Renew or Xavier Johnson or whoever, they just think that they've got good enough players to win those straight up and not have to do something a little bit unusual offensively. But those teams also probably aren't going to foul you as much. And so you're not going to be able to count on, I think Indiana had 32 attempts against Wright State. They had 30 attempts against Army. They had Florida Gulf Coast. They had fewer attempts against Army. They only had 22, but they made 18 of them. That was their best free throw shooting night so far this season. The point is, even as some of this sort of, I guess, equalizes or sort of distributes to the mean, you're still facing some real concerns here. And I think this has become particularly pronounced this season because, it's only a 3-game stretch, but it's 3 games at home against teams that Indiana should be longer, stronger, and more athletic than, in the aggregate. Indiana's really struggled in all 3 of these games to defend the 3-point line, and it's become even more pronounced as Indiana's not taken more than 16 in a game so far this season, not made more than 4. Those are both incredibly low numbers. And if you just put 3 more makes and attempts on Indiana's ledger in each of these games, every single one of them would look and feel a little bit more comfortable than it ultimately wound up being. But that's kind of the thing that, that's what Indiana's kind of gotten locked into here, frankly, is just that they're in this place where the offense has evolved in a direction across multiple coaches now that has really just not found a way to consistently weaponize the 3-point line. And now you're suddenly maybe dealing with some defensive issues that are going to make that problem even more pronounced because you're struggling to defend the 3-point line more. For Connecticut specifically, it's worth saying, Connecticut so far this season has been more of a 2-point shooting team than a 3-point shooting team. They've got a handful of guys that have played, decent minutes, and Alex Caravan is 5 of 13 from behind the arc. Cam Spencer, the Rutgers transfer, is 11 of 24. That's 45.8%. So he's a threat there. But as a team, While UConn is 39th in the country in three-point attempts as a percentage of overall field goal attempts, they're 196th in percentage of points scored off threes, and they're 152nd in three-point shooting accuracy. They also won't have Stephen. It sounds like they won't have Stephen Castle for this game. So, it will this be something that UConn exploits a ton? I'm certain that they will attempt to with the players they've got that are better shooting threes, like Spencer and Caravan. I don't know that you'll necessarily see them commit to putting 35 attempts up, even if some of those shots aren't good shots. But the wider issue here is just that no matter what happens in a one-game sample size, Indiana has 6+ years now of data. Sorry, I've got a notepad over here with all these numbers. I talk with my hands. If you've not noticed in these videos, forgive me. Indiana's got 6+ years of data that say that this has just been a problem for a long time. One that Indiana's been unable to fix, and one that has become a clear and present threat as we've kind of seen Indiana's defensive issues evolve through these first three games, with a team that is going to probably remain sort of raw around the edges for a while. So just wanted to kind of change it up. That is something people have been talking a lot about. Again, that article linked below the video goes into a lot of depth with this and presents a lot of the numbers, a lot of the year-by-year stuff, and sort of points to some of the key trends and trend lines. But just wanted to kind of talk about this more analytically in the Friday rundown this week, because it is something that is just such a topic of conversation right now for Indiana fans, and understandably, it's a problem, it's a concern, and it's got to get addressed long term. I won't do any three keys on football other than simply to say, obviously, these last two games, Indiana can't get to 6 wins. We know that. There may be space for a handful of 5-7 teams in the bowl field this season. I'd have to dig through. I was going to dig through after this weekend and kind of figure out where Indiana fit in that, if that was something that might involve Indiana at some point. But I think it's fair to say that even if Indiana got into a bowl at 5-7, I think everybody in the program would still acknowledge that work needed to be done to kind of get the program back to a level of competitive quality that everybody could be comfortable with. I think no matter what kind of happens in that weird hypothetical of 5-7 teams going to bowls, I think it is fair to say that this team will see this season in a baseline way as a failure for not reaching a bowl game. I think it will also see this season, or the momentum and sort of the emotion it carries out of this season, I think for better or worse, will be defined heavily by these last two games, and whether Indiana can maybe finish on the high, can continue showing some progress that it feels like it can carry into an off season with some really good young pieces, and it'll have won both its trophy games, and it'll have won more games than it did a season ago. Or does Indiana kind of trip and fall in either or both of these games, and then it does start to feel like, for all the sort of patches of progress we've seen at times from this team this season, the longer term trends don't look very positively sustainable. We'll leave it there for this week. For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. This has been the Friday Rundown. Thank you so much for watching. We'll talk to you soon.